You can fake good vibes, you can fake mindfulness, and you can definitely fake peace. But you cannot fake shadow work and the radical, ego-stripping integration of your own darkness. The truly awakened aren't performing, and that's exactly how you recognize them. To really understand who has done the work, we have to stop looking for light and start looking for depth. In our current culture, we've been sold a version of awakening that looks like a curated Instagram feed, all white linen, peaceful meditation poses, and good vibes only. But if we look back at Carl Jung's original blueprints for the soul, that's not awakening. That's just a new, shinier mask. Jung's core idea was that we all carry a shadow, a psychological basement, where we shove everything about ourselves that we find shameful, scary, or incompatible with who we want to be. Most people spend their entire lives guarding that basement door, terrified of what's inside. The people we're talking about, the truly integrated ones, are those who have finally stopped guarding the door, walked down the stairs with a flashlight, and invited those hidden parts of themselves up for coffee. The awakened aren't the ones who claim to be perfect. They are the ones who are no longer shocked by their own capacity for darkness. You can see it in their eyes. There is a weightiness to them, a groundedness that comes from no longer being in a civil war with themselves. When you meet someone who has done the real shadow work, the first thing you notice isn't their holiness, it's their wholeness. They don't leak energy trying to hide their flaws. They don't react with vitriol when they are criticized. They have a strange, quiet thermostat effect on the rooms they enter. Because they are at peace with their own internal monsters, your monsters don't feel the need to bark at them. They are the quietly integrated, and once you know the signs of this psychological alchemy, you'll realize they are everywhere, operating from a place of radical self-honesty that makes the rest of the world's performance look exhausting. To understand this transition, we have to realize that most of us are walking mirrors, constantly reflecting our own unacknowledged traits onto everyone we meet. When someone has truly walked through the fire of Jungian shadow work, that mirror finally stops distorting. They stop seeing the world as a collection of villains and idiots and start seeing it as it actually is. This brings us to the first, and perhaps most jarring, sign that you are in the presence of an integrated soul, the absolute death of the pointing finger. In Jungian psychology, projection is the ultimate defense mechanism. It is the act of taking an internal quality, usually something we find repulsive like greed, cowardice, or arrogance, and projecting it onto someone else. It's why the most insecure people are often the most judgmental, and why the person who hates liars above all else is usually the one lying to themselves. When you encounter someone who has done the real work, you are encountering someone who has reclaimed their projections. They've realized that when they point a finger at someone else, 3 fingers are pointing back at them. Think about the last time you saw someone get publicly criticized or unfairly blamed. Most of us have an immediate, visceral reaction. Our heart rate spikes, our jaw tightens, and we begin formulating a defense. We feel the need to correct the record because our ego feels under attack. But the integrated person, they have a peculiar, almost eerie stillness. I once watched a mentor of mine get berated by a client who was clearly projecting their own failures onto him. The client called him incompetent and out of touch. Instead of defending himself or firing back an insult, my mentor simply listened. There was no mask of assurance. He was genuinely curious. When the client finished, my mentor said, "I can see why you'd feel that way. There have been times where I've let my own ego get in the way of a project. Is that what you're seeing here? Or is there something specific I can fix?" The client was stunned. The fight died instantly because there was no second ego to bounce off of. My mentor didn't need to be the hero or the expert. He had already met his own incompetent idiot shadow years ago. So when the client called him one, it didn't hurt. It was just a possibility to be examined. You can see this in the smallest daily interactions. Imagine a long line at a grocery store and a cashier who is being slow and grumpy. The unintegrated person fumes. They think, how lazy and disrespectful. I would never be that unprofessional. They are projecting their own repressed laziness or their rigid need for control. The shadow worker observes the cashier and thinks, I know that feeling of being overwhelmed and hating my day. I've been that version of myself before. They don't see a bad person. They see a part of humanity they've already encountered within themselves. This isn't just about being nice. It's about psychological sovereignty. When you stop projecting, you stop being a victim of your environment. You realize that your enemies are often just your own shadows wearing different clothes. The person who has done the work is awake, because they are no longer sleepwalking through life, reacting to their own reflections. They possess a terrifyingly beautiful level of self-responsibility. They don't blame the economy, their ex, or their boss for their internal state. They know that while they can't control the world, they have full ownership over the basement of their own mind. When you meet someone who has reached this level, you'll feel a strange sense of safety. You realize they aren't judging you, not because they're a saint, but because they've already judged themselves so thoroughly that there's no judgmental energy left for you. Once the finger stops pointing outward, something remarkable happens to the internal landscape. When you stop obsessing over the specks in everyone else's eyes, you finally have the clarity to sit with the logs in your own. But here is the kicker. Sitting with your own logs, your own greed, your envy, your darker impulses, eventually turns into a superpower. It builds a psychological muscle that most people simply don't have. This leads us to the second unmistakable hallmark of the integrated soul, a profound, unshakable tolerance for the ugly truths of the human condition. In the world of performative wellness, people often create a spiritual no-fly zone around anything negative. They use positive vibes only as a shield to keep the uncomfortable parts of life at bay. But Carl Jung warned us that the shadow is like a basement flood. The longer you ignore it, the more the foundation rots. The person who has done the real work doesn't need a shield. Because they have already waded through their own wreckage, they aren't afraid of yours. They have developed what I call non-shockable presence. Think of a time you felt a taboo emotion. Maybe you felt a flash of jealousy when your best friend got promoted. Maybe you felt a secret sense of relief when a perfect couple you know announced their divorce. Most people, when they hear these things, immediately jump into fix-it mode or judgment mode. They say, "Oh, you shouldn't feel that way," or "That's not like you." They do this because your darkness triggers their unintegrated shadow. Your honesty threatens their carefully constructed good person identity. But the awakened individual, they don't flinch. If you confess to them that you're struggling with a feeling that feels ugly or shameful, they don't look at you with pity or disgust. They look at you with the recognition of a fellow traveler. They might even laugh, not at you, but at the absurdity of the human ego. They have a high tolerance for the truth because they've realized that feeling something isn't the same as being something. Imagine you're going through a period of life where you are objectively a mess. You're bitter, you're venting, and you're perhaps not your best self. The surface friend. will eventually distance themselves because your energy is too heavy. They need you to be balanced so they can feel comfortable. The shadow worker sits in the mud with you. They don't try to silver lining your grief or gratitude shame your anger. I remember talking to a friend who had clearly done this level of work. I was spiraling, admitting to some pretty selfish thoughts I was having during a breakup. I expected a lecture. Instead, he just took a sip of his coffee and said, "Yeah, the ego really hates losing its grip, doesn't it? It'll tell you some wild lies to keep you feeling powerful. It's a hell of a ride." By acknowledging the ugly truth without judgment, he took the power away from it. He didn't make me feel like a monster. He made me feel like a human. This sign is easy to spot once you know what to look for. Look for the person who can talk about failure, envy, and rage without whispering or looking around the room. These individuals are awake because they have accepted the full spectrum of the human experience. They know that the gold is often hidden in the dark. By having a high tolerance for the ugly truths, they become the only people capable of offering true, transformative compassion. They don't love you despite your shadow. They love you because they've seen their own, and they know that the shadow is exactly where the light enters. When you stop being terrified of the ugly truths hiding in your basement, you realize something liberating. You no longer have to spend all your energy maintaining the perfect house at the top of the stairs. Most people are exhausted because they are constantly on, performing a version of themselves that is acceptable, impressive, or safe. But when the shadow is integrated, the need for a polished front evaporates. This brings us to the most visible, and yet most subtle, marker of the awakened: the death of the persona. In Jungian terms, the persona is the social mask we wear to navigate society. It's the professional at the office, the devoted daughter at occasions, the cool intellectual at the party. Jung didn't think the persona was bad. It's a necessary tool for survival. But he warned that the greatest tragedy is when we forget we are wearing a mask and start believing the mask is who we really are. The person who has done the real shadow work has performed a psychological unmasking. They still function in society, but the mask is thin, transparent, and loosely held. Think about the last time you met someone who made no effort to impress you. Not in a lazy or rude way, but in a way that felt like they had nothing to prove. They didn't lead with their job title, they didn't name drop, and they didn't perform their virtues. Most people use their persona as a shield. If I can convince you I am the successful entrepreneur, you won't see my fear of failure. The integrated person has dropped the shield. Because they have already accepted their own mediocrity, their own failures, and their own ordinariness in the shadow, they don't need you to validate their greatness. There is a profound lack of pretension about them. They are the same person when they are talking to a CEO as they are when they are talking to a janitor. Imagine a room full of people networking. Everyone is on. They are pitching their lives as if they are products. The persona-identified person is constantly scanning the room for who is important. They adapt their personality to fit the expectations of the person in front of them. They are a social chameleon, but they leave the event feeling drained and hollow. The shadow worker is just there. They might admit they're feeling socially anxious. They might confess they only came for the appetizers. They are real in a way that feels almost startling. I once saw a highly respected speaker finish a massive keynote. Afterward, a young student asked him a complex question, trying to sound smart. Instead of giving a guru answer to maintain his persona, the speaker tilted his head and said, You know, I've been thinking about that for 10 years, and my honest answer is, I have no idea. Every time I think I've figured it out, my ego proves me wrong. The room went silent. In that moment, he was more influential through his not knowing than he was through his entire 60-minute speech. He had killed the expert persona and let the self speak. When the persona dies, presence takes its place. You can feel it when you're with them. You don't feel like you're talking to a role. You feel like you're talking to a human. The awakened are among us because they have stopped trying to stand above us. They have realized that the most important thing you can be is deeply, authentically human. They don't need the stage, the title, or the enlightened aesthetic. They have traded the exhausting weight of 1,000 masks for the simple, quiet weight of being themselves. And the strangest part? Because they aren't trying to be anyone special, they become the most magnetic people in the room. Once you stop hiding behind a mask of niceness and drop the performance of the perfect persona, you're left with something raw and incredibly potent, your actual power. Most people are good only because they are afraid of conflict, afraid of being disliked, or afraid of their own capacity for harm. But shadow work changes the math. It turns a fragile, passive piece into a robust, conscious strength. This leads us to the final, most formidable sign of the integrated. They own their monster. There is a profound difference between being peaceful and being harmless. Carl Jung famously noted that a person who is incapable of being cruel isn't virtuous, they're just weak. True virtue requires having the capacity for the monster within you, but keeping it under voluntary control. Jung believed that to be a complete human, you must have your sword, but keep it sheathed. The person who has done the real work doesn't deny their capacity for aggression, selfishness, or coldness. Instead, they've integrated these forces so they can use them as fuel for boundaries, courage, and truth. Think of the nice person who always says yes, never raises their voice, and is constantly walked over. We often mistake this for spiritual maturity. But underneath that niceness, a shadow is usually festering with resentment and passive aggression. Now, think of the integrated person. They are often some of the kindest people you'll meet, but there is a weight to their kindness. It doesn't feel like a desperate plea for your approval. It feels like a choice. You can sense that they could be formidable if the situation called for it. They don't shy away from the dark, so they aren't intimidated by yours. Imagine a situation where someone is being bullied or an injustice is happening in a social circle. The unintegrated person either joins in the gossip, shadow projection, or stays silent because they don't like drama, fear masked as peace. The shadow worker steps in, but they don't step in with hysterical rage. They step in with a terrifying, calm clarity. I once saw a colleague, a man who spent years in deep therapy and shadow work, confront a toxic boss. The boss was screaming, using intimidation to get his way. My colleague didn't scream back. He didn't cower. He sat back, looked the boss directly in the eyes with a completely neutral expression, and said, "I understand you're frustrated, but you're using your fear to try to control this room. It won't work on me. Let's talk when you've regained your composure." The boss actually stopped mid-sentence. Why? Because my colleague wasn't judging the boss from a place of moral superiority. He was speaking from a place of, I know that monster in you, because I have it in me too, and I've learned how to master mine. That is the power of the sheathed sword. Why? This is awakening. Owning your monster means you are no longer a victim of your impulses or other people's projections. When you have integrated your shadow, you gain access to your will. You become someone who can say no and mean it. You become someone who can protect the weak without becoming a tyrant yourself. The awakened aren't the ones floating in clouds of love and light. They are the ones with their feet planted firmly in the earth, fully aware of their own capacity for darkness, and choosing, every single day, to use that energy for something constructive. They are awake because they are no longer afraid of themselves. And in a world driven by unconscious fear, that makes them the most powerful people in the room. Before we reach the end of this journey, there is one more subtle, almost invisible quality to look for. Once a person has stopped projecting, accepted the ugly truths, dropped their mask, and mastered their monster, they develop a very specific kind of relationship with the world around them. They move from a state of reaction to a state of action. This leads us to the final hidden marker, the end of moral outrage. In our modern landscape, outrage is a currency. We often signal our goodness by how loudly we condemn the badness of others. From a Jungian perspective, much of what we call social justice or moral standing is actually just shadow displacement. We find a villain out there to crucify, so we don't have to look at the micro-villainy in our own hearts. The person who has integrated their shadow has lost the taste for this kind of performance. They have replaced righteous outrage with deep discernment. Watch how someone reacts to a scandal or a polarizing headline. The unintegrated person immediately takes a side. They use words like evil, disgusting, or monstrous. They feel a surge of dopamine because, by comparison, they feel pure. Their ego is fed by the fin of condemnation. The shadow worker pauses. They might be saddened, and they might take action to help, but they don't feel superior. They look at a perpetrator and think, under the right or wrong set of circumstances, with enough trauma and pressure, that capacity exists in the human blueprint, and I am human. This isn't an excuse for bad behavior. It's a radical understanding of it. They don't need to scream at the world to prove they aren't part of the problem. They know the line between good and evil runs straight through every human heart, including their own. So how to start your own integration? Today, audit your triggers. The next time someone makes your blood boil, don't ask, what is wrong with them? Ask, what part of me is being reflected in this person that I have yet to accept? Practice ugly. Honesty. Find one trusted person and confess a thought you usually hide, not for attention, but to practice being seen in your wholeness. Release the mask. In your next social interaction, try to go 5 minutes without trying to impress anyone. Speak from the self, not the persona. The awakened are among us, but they aren't here to lead us. They are here to show us that the basement isn't as scary as we think, and that the only way to truly find the light is to walk right through the heart of our own darkness. If you're ready to stop chasing light and start finding your wholeness, let's keep this journey going. Drop a comment below with the word integrated. Tell me about a time you realized you were projecting your shadow onto someone else. How did that moment of realization change you? Thanks for watching.